we started talking about doing things that you love. This is where doing things where you love really matter, right? Because it's through those dark times. You're doing for the pursuit of money. It's really easy not to go in and put, not to get out of bed that day when everything's going wrong, when the lawsuits are coming, when, there's HR cultural problems or server problems, scaling problems, right? But it's only when you're like, hey, this is a really motivating thing. This is something I'm so passionate about. That's what drives you. That's what can drive all of us, and why the mission of what you do, the thing that you do, it gives you purpose. That is key.
Today's guest is a visionary entrepreneur who transformed how millions of Americans manage their personal finances. Ken Lin is the founder and former CEO of Credit Karma, a platform that helped democratize access to credit scores and financial tools, making them free and easy to understand for everyday consumers. Ken launched Credit Karma in 2007 with a mission to bring transparency to an industry that had long been opaque and intimidating. What started as a bold idea quickly became a fintech juggernaut, ultimately reaching over 100 million users and selling to Intuit at a landmark $8.1 billion acquisition. But Ken's story isn't just about building a unicorn. It's about challenging a convention, staying mission-driven, and proving that doing good can also be good business. His journey from the son of immigrants to leading one of Silicon Valley's biggest consumer success stories offers valuable lessons in resilience, leadership, and innovation. I hope you'll be as inspired as I was by our conversation. And welcome to Hyphen Nation. I'm with my friend Ken Lin, founder and CEO of Credit Karma, which he founded in 2007 and sold to Intuit for $8.1 billion. Ken, thanks for being on the podcast today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so Ken, this is a podcast I'm doing for people who are execs, founders, and those who want to be inspired by different folks in the community. And your story has been the dream of many, and so I know that you will inspire a lot of people with your story. Let's go back to the beginning. You were born in Guangzhou, China, and moved to the U.S. at the age of 4. To Las Vegas, where your parents worked in casinos and blackjack tables and restaurants to pay for your tuition at Boston University. And what did your parents do when they were back in China?
That's a great question. I actually
You
don't
don't
know the
know?
answer to that one. I never
I've
asked
stumped
my
you already?
parents about what they
My God,
did
the life
back then.
before you.
I mean, all I know is, when they came to the States, I mean, for them, they were hustlers in every sense of the story, meaning that, they were always working multiple jobs. My dad worked in a restaurant, 6 days a week. I mean, the only day he got off was effectively Monday. And I saw my mom working multiple jobs just to make ends meet. And I think that always resonated with me. And it also reminded me of how hard they worked. And for me, and kept me grounded. It also gave me a sense of purpose and work ethic.
Yeah. No, I mean, it sounds like they spent many, many hours working to support you. And I forgot, you don't have any other siblings? Are you only child?
I actually have a younger brother. We're about 8 years apart, and
Wow.
the reason why we're so far apart is there was the one child policy back in China. They couldn't even have kids, or they couldn't have a second kid while they were in China. So it's a very different time growing up.
You and your brother, I guess, growing up, in past company interview, I saw that your parents were always starting something and that they really influenced you growing up. They had time to start stuff after like spending all those hours at work?
Well, not all those jobs lasted, right? So I think they were
Mm,
always trying to do stuff, right? So they owned a Chinese restaurant at one point. I remember when my mom worked a full-time job. She actually still does this today, even after I exited Credit Karma. During one of the lunar festivals, she would take 2 weeks off and make zong, which is like the Chinese tamales, right? And she would like make like 5,000 of them, right? It would be a factory almost at her house that she would do. And, it was just always what I saw her doing. And again, to this day, she still does it. I think it's part of her ethos, part of her work ethic. And I think those things stick with you when you see it.
so she still makes 5,000 songs like, and is there like a freezer full of
Believe
them
it or
somewhere in
not,
the
she
garage?
does. She has like all these old, I don't know, customers, friends, people that she's met with all over the
Wow.
years, and they'll, call her ahead of the time of the year, and say like they want 100, and
Yeah.
lo and behold, when the time comes, they'll be ready.
I'm so bad. I'm like, it's Autumn Festival, right? Is that the one? Or is it
Yeah, I
Spring
think
Festival?
so. Yeah, I think it's
You
like
and I were
autumn
like,
Migu
the time of
festival. Yeah,
year. You're like the time of year. I'm like, which one is that one?
I don't want to say it because I wasn't 100% sure.
Yeah, it's all right. All good. Yeah, so your mom was I guess pretty entrepreneurial that way, and she's like, making, and then was your dad also pretty entrepreneurial?
My dad was sort of the steady source of income, right? So he was the one who was working, 60, 70 hours a week. So I think he was sort of the stability side, and my mom was always trying to figure out, sort of the next opportunity.
And so when I saw that you were the first in your family to graduate from college. What did you, I mean, growing up, I mean, your aspirations, I'm reminded by in 38th Garden, people are like, oh, people aspire to be at the middle management at Deloitte. And so growing up in Vegas and you see your mom and dad kind of, working hard all the time, like what did you aspire to when you were going through BU? It sounded like you were pretty entrepreneurial too.
Yeah, well, the funny thing is, growing up in a Asian and very Asian family, the joke goes, you're either a doctor, a lawyer, or a failure, right? I don't like the sight of blood, and I'm not a particularly great writer, so I think the two of those really forbade the idea of me being a doctor or a lawyer. I had a calling around math, and what I really found in college was I really liked economics, and I really, in particular around economics, I really like data modeling, right? I like the econometric side of school. So after college, I went to school for math and econ. I realized I really like econometric statistics. And I came out of school working for a credit card company. Didn't know what that was going to lead to, but it was something I generally enjoyed is actually one of the things I talk about, which is finding something that you enjoy and something you have a passion for versus something that you think will, create wealth because you can create wealth doing things that you enjoy. I think
Mhm.
it's harder just going after the pursuit of money. I think that's a lot harder. But yeah, that was sort of like the family aspect of it. But it was econ and math that drove me for many years in school.
Well, so you bring that up as like it's go after something you enjoy versus money, but like your parents were working hard to make money to survive as immigrants to this country. Did you feel like they pressured you to focus on money, or they gave you the freedom to, go do what you wanted to do?
I don't think they pressured me to focus on money, but I think it was an undercurrent of like, well, you got to do something to, help you get further ahead, right? And that's the backdrop of them coming to America for me, which was, China in the 70s is not the China that we see in 24, 25. Right? There just wasn't that much opportunity, and the economy was really struggling. For many immigrants like my parents, China was an opportunity for you to get ahead. And I think that was really the backdrop. It wasn't necessarily to get wealthy, but to have a better life. And what I could see from the way they worked and the way that they talked was really about a better life for me and my brother than they would have otherwise, had they stayed in China.
Yeah. And so you were working at a credit card company on the side where you work selling the computer parts? Like,
Yeah, so I guess going back to both your question and the context, I always saw my parents, really starting little side hustles. And one of the first things I did in college was right after graduation, I had this little two-bedroom condo. And back then, this idea of overclocking computer chips was in vogue, right? Which is like you would buy a slower processor, but they could go faster. And you would test which ones could go faster, and the ones that could go faster, you would just sell them at a higher margin than the ones that were just standard. And, I started a little computer business doing that. And, after a course about a year or two, it actually took off to where, I had a whole extra bedroom full of computer parts. I'd work as a data analyst at a credit card company during the day. And at night, I'd go build computers and test chips to see if they would overclock or not. And, at some point, it came to this junction where I'd had to decide whether I was going to follow my professional career, which was, in the credit card company or continue to sell computer parts online. And, I think it's a series of journeys. In that particular case, they decided that, well, you know what, I was doing pretty well on the data science side, the credit card side of the world. So I decided to stick with that. I sold the computer business, but it gave me a little bit of taste of entrepreneurship. And from there, I rolled that into an internet gaming cafe, which was sort of the next chapter for me. I love video games. A lot of people were buying the overclocked PCs were doing to play games. And
mm.
this is at the time of LAN cafes becoming big and people playing Counter-Strike and World of Warcraft. And I opened up three internet cafes along the way. So, for me, it was always jump a little bit like my parents, right? Jumping from venture to venture and really trying to find something that sticks.
So instead of Zongzi in a room, you had computer parts in a room. So you did emulate your mom that way. And it was like a side hustle. I mean, I feel like a lot of Asian founders start off as a side hustle because they have their secure job that their parents are okay with, and then they got to take that risk on the side without, necessarily letting their parents know. Yeah, I did the same thing when I was working to start the company on the side. But it sounds like that So you were at the credit card company, you sold the company, but then the internet cafe, you were full time on that then? You had left your
Yeah,
credit card?
there's a lot, and then I worked at another company for a little. So I went, this is a long story, but
I
I
mean,
was
it
trying to,
sounds like your parents juggling multiple jobs at the same time.
that's exactly what it was, right? So from the credit card company, I actually started another company called You Promise, which was actually no, I went to a tech company called Fair Market,
Uh-huh.
and they were sort of effectively pre-IPO before the bubble, and I worked there at the same time. This is when the internet cafe came along.
Wow.
And I ran both for actually, I think about 2 years or so. And then I actually, this is where I think a little bit of that history and being able to take risks come into play. We went public, it was doing really well, and then the dot-com bubble came and it wasn't doing
Hmm.
so well. And at that point, I think I had like two or three of the internet cafes, and I realized that, well, this might be an interesting, better pursuit for me.
Yeah.
So I actually left the corporate world, focused full time on the internet cafes. We had three of the internet cafes. They were interesting. I learned a ton, and this is what I always tell people: is you got to learn from every experience. I enjoyed it as a challenge, like running a retail business. The logistics of it are super hard. Retail in my learning now is it's really hard. And what we found was, hey, the stores that I ran, I was part of, they did pretty well. The stores that we hired other people to do, they didn't do as well, right? Goes about finding the right people, the right leadership, the right managers to
Yeah.
run those facilities. But that was an adventure for me, right? And I learned a lot about retail. I learned really now another, a bigger business than the computer parts store. So everything was growing and everything was a lesson and everything was another set of challenges ahead of me.
So it was a side hustle that turned into out to be like a hedge for the job, the company that wasn't working out.
Yep.
So I mean, I feel like that's a sign, but it also forced you to double down on the internet cafes. But then you started multi-links marketing while you were doing the cafes or
This
after?
is where I was sort of like the interweaving it.
Your timeline's like,
Yeah, so I ran the internet cafes for a while, but then the whole trend started to dissipate a little bit in a sense. And I think it's another thing about retail, right? You have to constantly reinvent
you never
yourself.
know.
The
Yeah.
business was doing okay, but it wasn't growing the same way that it had been growing the first, 2 or 3 years. So I thought I would dip my toes back into corporate life. I ended up going to a company at You Promise, which is a company that helped you save for your child's 529. And I also learned quite a bit there, right? So it created a couple avenues for me. One was it gave me a corporate job that, unlike my other ones prior, were much more altruistic, right? So the idea of the
Hmm.
business was if you buy these particular products, it would help you save for your child's future, right? In the form of a rebate that goes towards a college tuition program. So I really learned that, hey, you can actually have a business that, sort of, does good. And I thought that was really important. Led me to California because when the woman I was working for left You Promise, she came out to Elone on the West Coast and
Hmm.
she said, you should come out and work for me there. And, we talked and I said, hey, California's great. It's closer to my parents. I like the West Coast. So that led to a set of opportunities. So I left You Promise and came out to the Bay Area and worked at Elone. I think this is 2004.
I remember because I was at Yahoo Finance and Elon was paying a lot of our bills because they're for lead gen, the ads, the banners, and everything all over Yahoo Finance. Probably when you were still there, they were still, it was good lead gen for them. I think they actually ran like some of our loan platforms for us, so small. But that you promise is kind of along the lines align with what you were doing with Credit Karma because it sounds like you were helping figure out a way to help people, in an altruistic way, getting their credit scores without having to like get these three credit bureaus to charge them whatever money to get their score, which is supposed to be free. But that didn't happen until 2003 was when Congress gave Americans the right to request their credit report free once a year, right? But you hadn't started till 2007.
Yeah, that's right. Well, this is actually an interesting thing too, which is, yeah, I didn't know this until later on. Elon was really the pioneer of that, right? But that was before my day. So the
Yeah.
context is Elon started giving away credit scores when you applied for a mortgage. I'm going to get the years precisely wrong, but probably around 2001, 2002. And they were actually challenged by the credit bureaus and, the industry itself to say, hey, you can't do this.
Were they subsidizing it? Is that why?
Well, no. I mean, Elon was a mortgage company, so they would, buy the report, and as just as a byproduct of you
Like,
doing the
right.
loan
Yeah,
process,
they already paid
they would
for it.
just
Yeah.
give you the score.
Yeah, they already had it. Yeah.
The bureaus are like, wait a minute, scores are an industry metric, right?
Yeah,
They're
you
not
can't do that.
consumer facing. Little did I know, little did they know that they would create a, sort of money
Business.
multi-billion dollar industry because of that one thing. But the bureaus fought back against the loan, fought against the bureaus. And to your point, I don't know who drove the legislation, but ultimately consumers had access through both FACTA, and FICRA, which are really the two a
Yeah.
piece of legislation that made accurate credit reporting and credit score access available.
And then, so then 2007, when you were trying to get your own credit score, that's when you decided to start? Or like, what
Yeah.
was the origin story?
Yes. So, there's all these interweaving of my own sort of professional
Yeah.
journey and then my branching out. So when I came out to Elon, to your point, we were doing all of this lead gen, and we were a really good marketing company. We had won a lot of awards for, our ability to be very data centric, to really do performance marketing at scale. And I said, well, why don't I parlay a lot of that experience, a lot of the opportunity. So I actually started my own marketing agency, Multilytics, and that was another chapter where we grew to maybe like 30 employees. We were managing uh, $50 million a year in marketing budget with Liberty Mutual, with Wells Fargo, as just a couple of our clients. And that's really the origin story of Credit Karma, which was, while I was running that business, I had this observation that, um, it was really hard to be efficient in online marketing, because if you were a financial services company, and I'll just throw out, Prosper, for example, which is one
Yeah.
of our first clients, they might need a consumer that is sort of, average credit score. If the credit score is too low, they couldn't give that person a loan. If that credit score was too high, you'd go to American Express, or you'd go to some other bank, and they'll get a better rate. So, for every dollar we were spending, on average, 2/3 of it were going wasted. Right? A third was going to
Hmm.
people who had low credit scores. A third was going to
Yeah.
people who had high credit scores. So
Yeah.
you were highly inefficient. And I thought to myself, my gosh, there's got to be a better way, right? This is never going to scale. And this brings me back to my very first job, which was at the credit card company, which was this idea that, one of the things that worked really well was direct mail, right? Direct mail pre-screens. And the reason why those things worked is with direct mail, you'd actually know the credit score of the person that you were mailing, right? So all those pre-approved offers, that model exists
Hmm.
in mail.
Hmm.
I said, it'd be really interesting if this model existed in online and online
Hmm.
marketing, and combined with the idea that at the same time, it was really hard to get your credit score, right? To your point, that industry that was created, it was dominated by players who had this negative opt-out model, which really means you
Yeah.
go to the site, you say you want your free credit score, they say put in your credit card number,
Yeah.
they give you the score, and what you don't really see is that you're
You're
enrolled in credit
subscribing.
monitoring.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you're
Yeah.
charged $20 a month until you
Yeah.
realize that you're being charged, which may
Yeah.
be 10 months later, and you've paid a whole bunch of money to get your quote unquote free credit score. So the model and the idea behind Credit Karma is that we could actually give the score away, and then have that score help power things that would give you better offers, help you save money. This comes back to the you promise idea of being altruistic in the business. That's the culmination of the two. And, one of the beautiful things I found about being in the Bay Area is that because the ecosystem was so rich with entrepreneurs and with venture capitalists, right? It just seemed like everyone was working out of a Starbucks. Everyone was working on a venture. And it just felt so natural. So while I had Multilytics up and running, I said, listen, I think there's another business here that's more scalable, that's more interesting, that's more innovative. And that was the journey around Credit Karma. And we incorporated in 2007, and we launched our beta users in 2008.
So you essentially created a better way for targeting because you've already like pre-filtered candidates that these deals could go to, so they're not just spraying and praying. I mean, like they used to, because they don't know what they're getting with them otherwise. I mean, all that from the past e-loan you promised all coming in this. So did you feel like when you were starting this, it was a risk because you've already taken so many risks before? It didn't feel like one, right?
Oh, well, it was, I mean, it's definitely a risk, right? So keep in mind that, I was working at Multilytics, and that was a good job. I mean, it was paying the bills. It was, I was making more money than I ever had. I was actually saving money, which was, I think, the
Yeah.
first time in my
But
life
that was
where,
your company. You started it too, right?
Yeah. And so it was a risk in that what I didn't like about that business is I think it was very sales oriented. It was very
Your clients,
for
yeah.
me, I was doing a bulk of the sales. I always found that if you do a great job, the CMO gets the credit. You do a bad
Yeah.
job, you get fired.
You get fired, yeah.
There's a tough there's no really happy medium in that.
Yeah.
So I thought there was something bigger and better and more interesting to do, and at the same time, be walking away from a job that was, paying me six figures, and I was, buying the home and the mortgage. So it was certainly still a risk, but I was probably 30 years old, and had an opportunity to take more risks. So that was the idea.
Got it. And then did you end up starting with friends that you knew already or like colleagues? How did you find your co-founders?
So it's really, really, I mean, a lot of good luck. And I always find them, I think there's a lot of good luck with any of these stories. So I had the idea, I was kicking around the idea with a bunch of friends, and Credit Karma was not the first idea. It was probably the 100th idea, right? It was the one that stuck with the friends in the conversation that I had. So I had the idea. I did a little bit of, fundraising in the sense I reached out to actually the former CEO of Elo, and I went to him. So long story short, I'd raised about $500,000, and it was time to find employees. And our first two employees, I mean, this is really good luck for me. The first person I approached was Nicole Mustard. She was someone that I worked with. She was at Compete. I worked with her when she was actually at Elo, and she was basically a consultant. I remember I asked her for a meeting. She had no idea what the meeting was about. I explained to her the idea of Credit Karma, and then on the spot, she actually said, "Yes, I'll do this," which I was shocked by.
Wow.
I thought this would be like, well, let me think about it. Let me do some research on the industry. But she's like, no, let's go do this. So she was really, co-founder number one. And then along the same time, I had a good friend of mine who was actually working at Multilytics. I was telling him, like, I really need a good engineer, and he's like, well, you know what, my fiance's best friend's husband, right? If you follow this, he's an engineer at IBM, and I think he's looking for something new. That ultimately turned out to be Ryan Graciano. So I called him up, explained to him what we were doing. He spent a little more time digging in, but he ultimately said yes. But it's amazing how these things come together in some ways,
Yeah.
right? It was,
Yeah.
just kind of sheer good luck, sure happenstance that I was able to get, two amazing co-founders. And by the way, I mean,
Yeah.
up until basically the time I left Credit Karma as of 4 months ago, they were
They're
still
still
with the
there.
company.
Yeah.
So, we've
Yeah.
been on the journey for 17 years together.
Yeah. I mean, it's rare that you don't have a founder divorce with kind of just conversation like that. People you barely knew, like that, that would join, and it's like, wow, they lasted the whole time. I mean, sounds like it paid off for everyone. Did you feel like you had a founder community back then with others? 'Cause sometimes as a CEO founder, it can be very lonely. I know you were part of, our, Asian American founder circle community, but like it isn't easy when you're the only one without all that kind of pressure on you because even your co-founders don't understand that kind of pressure. Did you have that very much?
Well, I think you're hitting on something that I think is really important. So the short answer is no. I mean, I think the Valley, FinTech, Asian founders, I mean, I think there's a lot of things that have changed over the last 17 years, but I certainly found it to be a lonely spot. I certainly found it that there weren't a lot of leaders who were Asian. There weren't a lot of role models who wasn't necessarily lived up to it. Well, I think the community was generally helpful. I don't think it's where it is now, but I always talk about, for me, I think the first, dozen years of Credit Karma, I felt like a little bit of an imposter. Right? I'm always trying to, like, how do I do things better? Not because I want to do them better, because I felt like, I don't look the part. I'm not that part,
Yeah,
and
you had to
I
prove
can't
yourself.
believe I all
Yeah,
this responsibility.
yeah,
Then it's only in the last 5 years or so that I got a lot more confidence in terms of leadership, but also made me realize that, that you have to put yourself out there. You have to be a role model. You have to, do these things. Otherwise, the next generation might feel the exact same way.
yeah.
But, I think through organizations like, YPO, through amazing board members who were my mentors, they helped me kind of see through all of that.
But it sounds like that's 12 years until you realize that. Like, what was the pre-Ken Lin CEO like, and then the post? Because I mean, you had to be an inspiring leader. It was almost like you needed validation from your, $1 billion of revenue or this or that before you felt, oh, okay, I did this. Now I can be confident. But before that, you still doubted yourself, even though you raised $300 million, whatever what it might have been, all those other metrics. Because here in the Valley, you see a lot of founders who had that confidence before they even raise a single penny. And so, yeah, why was it Why do you think that was the before and after that, like that did?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think one is, I think you always need a little bit of that validation, or I should say, I always need a bit of that validation. I think, it's not like I wore it on my sleeve, right? And to your point, it's one of those things you don't really confide a lot and you can't say it in front of the company. I think you can be vulnerable. You can tell people how you're feeling,
Sure.
but you wouldn't be like, listen, I'm not really sure about this whole leadership thing.
Yeah.
I think part of it was just a growth phase. I think part of it is, you learn how to be in more of the company eye, you learn how to inspire, but you also feel insecure about your abilities and you wonder, can I do this better? Can other people do this job better than me? So, I wouldn't say I was, uh, hiding or like completely uncomfortable, but in my mind, I was always looking for a little bit of the validation. More importantly, am I a good leader? Am I the right person for this role? Should it be somebody else? Should somebody else be able to grow the business better than I can, right? I mean, I think those were a lot of the questions that were
Yeah.
going through my head.
It's funny because I feel like a lot of Asian leaders often feel like they end up self-sabotaging because they do have that doubt, and then it basically is it's a self fulfilling prophecy because then they doubt like, am I the right leader? And then they get replaced because they question themselves too much. Or sometimes the board will think, oh, maybe there is someone better for this than you because you're not even sure if you can do it yourself. It's just a weird conundrum, and that lack of confidence I feel like so many of us have. I feel like a lot of it is from, and maybe your parents were different, but I feel like when you're younger and you have that self-doubt of not being perfect, because most leaders are not perfect, but many of the ones who've done well, like you see many of the Valley CEOs that are clearly not perfect, but they act like they are, or they don't care that they're not perfect. Very different than how if you're raised Asian and you're not perfect, you feel like you're a failure. And you're like, well, I'm a 98%, but I'm not 100%. Like, that's perfectly fine. Heck, even a 70% is probably fine. But we're not okay with that. And we feel like, oh, I'm a fraud because I'm not 100%.
Well, I think culturally there's the humility, there's the modesty that I think I'll point. I mean, the thing that I see now, and I have a lot of conversations with, other leaders. I always talk to them about like you need to have a little bit of swagger, right? I mean, I think there's like anything, there's balance, right? There's a point where
Yeah.
you become a
Arrogant.
jerk and nobody wants
Yeah.
to
Jerk.
work with
Yeah.
you, right? And you're
Yeah.
egotistical. But you have to have some confidence. You have to be able to inspire, right? And I think for me, it was the adjustment of moving from sort of the humility, the modesty, to being one that is, more of confidence and that we can do amazing things together.
Yeah.
And I think that was my journey through leadership and understanding that, this is the right place for me. This is the right role for me.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of times we get in that mode of like, like your mom, we're good at making all the zongs in the back room, but we don't be on the front selling it and like acting like we're the best zongs chef in the world kind of thing. But a little bit of both needs to be true. And I think hopefully the next generation learns that as well, that they can be that front man. I mean, I was very lucky because I worked at Yahoo when it was like, 1,000 people and Jerry Yang was around the corner for me and I saw him, right? So being able to see someone who looked like me do that is a big deal. And he was an engineer. He's a PhD, like engineering guy. So he wasn't your stereotypical, CEO, but seeing him there in front of the crowd and how he rallied folks, it was very inspiring because I hadn't seen that before, especially for a company that he built. And it's always interesting because you built Credit Karma, so obviously you were an inspirational leader because you built something from nothing. I think we forget that people follow us because of that as well. You don't have to be necessarily the best speaker or the best whatever, but the fact that you even created something from zero, in and of itself is a huge feat that is admired. But I think we always find ways to think, oh well, but I'm not as good a speaker as so and so, or I see that person and they're more this or that. But I mean, did you see? I mean, you didn't have anyone around you necessarily, so I feel like the one thing we have talked about is that without a peer group like YPO later on during those times, it can feel very lonely. And then the dark times. I mean, it sounds like you were near death a few times. When like was it TransUnion filed? Someone filed a suit against you. I mean, that's scary. Yeah, TransUnion. They received a cease and desist from your only data source, and that's pretty terrifying. And anytime you get legal letters or things like that, it's never fun. But if you don't have anyone around you, like that can be traumatic, and you don't have a therapist to talk to about this stuff, it's pretty rough. Like, what were those dark times like, and how'd you get through those?
Yeah, well, I mean, I always say this. So one is, this idea that, when you don't see other leaders who look like you, I don't love the spotlight, so to speak, right? But I realize that being in front of others is actually a way to pay it forward in terms of having people see. that you can do it, right? And you compare yourself to, like, somebody's always gonna do something better than you, but it's only when you have that confidence, that swagger, that, hey, I do a lot of things really well that no one else can do, and you recognize that, I think
Yeah.
that becomes, a bit of a superpower. Through those dark times, and there are many, right? And when you say death, it was, the death of the company, right? Nothing,
Yeah.
that,
No, not
and
personally.
in actual terms, not in little terms, but yeah, I mean, this is where having co-founders can be really important and valuable. For me, it was a lot of my early investors and board members, or a couple of board members in particular, that were really helpful in actually thinking through the problems and helping find the solution. So I think, having co-founders, having someone you can trust and confide in is really important. I oftentimes talk about that. And the last point, you talked a little bit about, we started talking about doing things that you love. This is where doing things where you love really matter, right? Because it's through those dark times, you're doing for the pursuit of money. It's really easy not to go in and not to get out of bed that day when everything's going wrong, when the lawsuits are coming, when, there's HR cultural problems or server problems, scaling problems, right? But it's only when you're like, hey, this is a really motivating thing. This is something I'm so passionate about. That's what drives you. That's what can drive all of us, and why the mission of what you do, the thing that you do, it gives you purpose. That is key. So for me, through those dark times, we had this single idea, which is, hey, we can transform the way that people think about their money. And for me specifically, I always thought about sort of the parents. I'm like, I want this product to be something that could help my parents, right? I want it to be transformative for them and all of our parents, right? Our
Hmm.
being the employees at Credit Karma. And I said, listen, if we can just do that one thing, if we can do that one family, that one person whose lives in a better place, no matter what happens, we will have changed someone's life for the positive, and we can feel really good about that. And I think it's those types of moments that will drive you forward through the darkest of times. And that's ultimately what drove us, which was, in those moments you realize, my gosh, whether it was we had one user or a million users or 10 million users, we would get these emails and these notes from people that said, hey, this product helped me do X, or this product helped me buy my very first home. It helped me improve my credit from, 500 to 700. And a dream of mine to own a home or to own a car, you realize that you're doing something valuable. And that was what was so motivating for all of us.
I mean, you've said it before. Like, I mean, in your advice to founders, that you should choose purpose over profit from the beginning. But nowadays, I feel like, for a while during ZERP times, there's like growth over everything, and I don't care how much you spend, just pay for all the users and grow. And now it's, we will not invest in you unless you are profitable already, and that's number one priority. So both of those, growth and profits, have been the driver for a lot of investors. To hear someone say choose purpose over profit, it sounds nice, but it sounds like it's what actually got you through the darkest times. Like, if you have a mission that actually makes sense, you'll actually have a better chance of surviving, and then just focusing on the dollars and cents, so unit economics all the time.
Well, when I say purpose and profit, I think there's a really important distinction, right? One of the things that we really started with as a foundation at Credit Karma was we always wanted to do the right thing. And the right thing for us was not selling your data, was not spamming you, was really being truthful as a brand. And, I remember through a lot of the potential us running out of money events, there was always an option like, well, we could just send more
Yeah, turn it
emails,
on.
make more money,
Yeah, turn
right?
on the faucet. Yeah.
Yeah, we could go and sell the data. We could make some more money. And I think for us, those were the areas, like, we'd rather go out of business than do
Mm,
those things that we aligned not to do, right?
yeah.
So, I don't think what works best is when the profit is aligned, with the purpose. And in many ways, that was when Credit Karma excelled at the best, which was we recognized what those were, right? I mean, one of the beautiful things about our model was when your credit score went up, um, you created more revenue for Credit Karma, right? Because
Hmm.
you're more desirable by the banks, right?
Yeah.
They pay more
Yeah.
for higher credit consumer score. So we're
Yeah.
motivated to do that.
Your
When
incentivizer
you
line.
apply,
Yeah.
when you applied for a product on our platform and you were denied, you hated that experience,
Yeah.
and we hated that experience, right? Like,
Yeah.
we didn't make
Yeah.
any money from that. Like, and when you get
Yeah.
those things just right, that's where the magic happened. And that's what
Yeah.
I talk about, and choosing those decisions, right? There are times when, like, things aren't going well. Like, I would do a lot of things, like, or you could do a lot of things to make more money. That's when you really have to go back to this purpose idea and not let the profits override, right? So, they can be synergistic, but you have to be mindful, disciplined, and aware of when they're not. And I think that's one of the hardest things, because there's a lot of temptations. You got investors who want to see double and triple digit growth, right? And it's
Yeah.
like, why didn't you sell more data? I'm like, well, because that's not what we do, right? And being able to hold that line and having that sense of purpose, that's when it really comes into play.
Did you feel like that led to a lot of heated board meetings? Because I mean, if I were your investors, it's like, dude, you could be doubling this. We can go public. Come on, hurry up and just like flip this thing and let's get us out of it. Because their incentives are not always aligned with yours either. Because they, they're trying to like get their money out with a certain timeline. Did you feel like you had a lot of kind of not necessarily hostile meetings, meetings where you had to stand your ground personally, and it was kind of stressful?
Well, I mean, this is where I think good fortune and
Hmm.
hopefully good relationships matter. But I can't remember a single board meeting like that. I mean, I had great board members who always had my back, and they knew, they often say, all money is green. And while that part of it is true, the investors are not all the same, right? And for me,
Hmm.
I always had gravitated towards investors who were both operators and entrepreneurs, meaning that they had experience running a business and they
Yeah,
knew that,
they
hey,
knew.
that like this isn't just, some Excel spreadsheet. I mean, at any
Yeah.
given point in time, I'm like, I have 100 people who rely on me to, for their paychecks that go home and
Yep.
pay the mortgages. Like, I'm not
Yeah.
going to squander that. I have a real responsibility. And sure, we
Yeah.
might be able to grow faster, but for me, it's more important to grow stably. There's a
Yeah.
lot of stories, and as I reflect on the 17 years, where I'm like, well, that was a really good decision. I mean, COVID being probably one of those decisions where
Yeah.
we had a lot of money in the bank and we were always measured in the way that we grew the business. And I think those things mattered. So back to the question, I mean, we had amazing board members. I remember there was one, it struck me as really cool in that there was one acquisitions that we were thinking about doing. It was a multi-$100 million acquisition. We were thinking about buying another company. And I remember I had a board member who's like, I think it's too much. And I want to go and share my point of view with you, Ken. I will still vote yes, but I just want you to understand like where I'm coming from and
Yeah.
my major concern points, right? And I think that's that's exactly what you want from your board members, for them to
Yeah.
speak up, to share advice and counsel, but
Yeah.
ultimately to have your back in the decisions that you're going to make.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you didn't, it was interesting because you didn't take money for, was it 2 years? Take any venture money for, was it 2 years after you got to 1 million users and you hadn't taken any outside venture money? Was that intentional? Because that seems, I mean, rare in the Valley.
No,
Or
it
was it
wasn't intentional. I mean,
you couldn't
we,
raise
we
it?
had we had friends and family dollars. The challenge was we'd raise those friends and family dollars, and then the Great Recession happened, right? So we had a
Oh,
million
yeah.
users,
It was
but
08, yeah.
2008, 2009 happened, right? And all the banks were unwinding. Fintech wasn't a category yet, so nobody wanted to invest in a business that was going to be making revenue from the banks. Now, the other thing that, this is a little known fact, but if you take our cumulative losses at Credit Karma, I think in the end we raised something like $1.2 billion. But if you take the cumulative losses, or all of our losses, our operating losses, I don't think we were ever more than $5 million worth of operating losses combined, right, at any single point. So we're super capital efficient, right? We
Yeah.
would, we started monetizing, effectively out of the gates. I remember when we
Yeah.
launched, we had a couple of placements on the site that would drive revenue, right? We always thought about, listen, we want to be able to pay the bills. We don't want to spend like drunken sailors. We want to do this responsibility. We are, a
Yeah.
financial responsibility
Yeah,
site. We
exactly.
have to operate that way.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, so that mean, I mean, so it actually was kind of a blessing that you couldn't raise that because you guys were very lean and efficient from the early days because you didn't have a lot of money in the bank. It was all friends and family money. Do you have advice for founders? And like you mentioned that you prefer operators and entrepreneurs as your board members and investors. Were there other things you looked for in these investors when you were having the conversations with them? Why you could have taken money from a lot of people, but like, would you say that you have a few rules or kind of the things that you look for when you're taking on money from someone?
Yeah, I mean, I think there has to be a candor around it. And what I mean by that is when it comes to alignment, like I am here to do this to change the industry. For example, there have been articles that we've written that have been participating in. Like I always said, like an IPO is not my end game, right? Because to me, an IPO is just a financing event. It's no different than
Hmm.
a Series D, a Series E, and now in context, when we were really hitting a lot of our growth, the private markets are really good. So you could go and raise, $500 million in a private
Yeah,
round that takes 3 weeks
that's not
versus
happening
an
again, but yeah,
IPO that takes months, right? But that's one area. And the other is, you really want board members who are going to contribute, who you can see and get along with. This goes back to this idea that like, not all money is created equal. So I would spend time with all these board members, really get a sense of who they were. And I want to make sure like, hey, are you aligned with the way that I see the business? If a downturn comes, like we're not going to sell our data, right? If a downturn
Yeah.
comes, we're not going to do credit karma brand things, meaning, sending you bad offers or sending you offers that like make us money but don't do anything for you. Like those would be conversations that we had have up front. And the good news is we always found board members who saw eye to eye with that.
Yeah. And did you do a lot of founder reference checking beforehand, or wait till they like showed their value before you actually took their money, or was it more of a kind of a gut decision?
A little bit of both. I mean, I think, in our Series A, I think we had two Series A term sheets. One was terrible. And then, several months later, we got one that was decent. So I don't know if I actually had a lot of options there.
Choice.
But the decent one was good enough. And then later on, when we actually had more leverage, I certainly did. I mean, I think always, when you have the ability to talk to people who work with others, that's incredibly valuable and you don't want to squander this. So I did definitely do reference checks on future investors.
Can you tell me, as a founder and CEO, like your best hire and your worst hire, like what you regretted about, like how you found your best hire, and then like what you regretted about your worst hire that you could give advice to other founders as they kind of go through hiring?
Oh gosh, I won't name names. It's
No,
like,
no names, no
it's like,
names, of course.
You make
But you're
one
learning
friend and a
from it.
lot of enemies, as they
No,
say.
no, you're learning from the situation. No names, no position, no title, no nothing.
You know what I found to be helpful is, you do your interviewing and you make a decision and you deal with it, right? I'll give you I didn't realize that this is what we were doing, but like there's statistics that show you, right? If the analogy is going to be a little bit weird, but I think it makes a ton of sense, which is if there are 100 people that you're going to meet and date in the world, right? And the idea is you date one at a time. And when do you know which is the right one? The optimal business strategy or the optimal solution in that game theory is you basically uh, make sure you don't pick anyone until you get to a third of the way through, and then you pick the best person after you meet after the 34th
Mhm.
person, right? And I think that's historically been roughly how I've sort of hired, which is you don't go for the very first person you meet because you don't know what the spectrum looks like. You make sure you go and find as many as you can, but you can always get into a world of sort of paralysis, right? Where you're like, listen, they don't tick every box, and I'm going
Yeah,
to keep looking, and you can look
yeah,
forever. And I guess my mode has always been to be pragmatic in that you can't start with the first one. You have to have a set of great candidates. But I think a lot of times people will focus on trying to find a perfect person, and they don't find that person for a year, and sometimes it doesn't work. And the good news is you put in the work up front. But if that person doesn't work out in a year, like great, there are a lot of options that you can do, and you can do things humanely, thoughtfully, without having it be a big deal. And I think that's the other aspect of hiring, right? I think we oftentimes will lament over these decisions because we feel like they're forever. They're not forever
yeah,
decisions.
yeah. Do you feel like that? Were there any ways that you felt like being, having an Asian background and your experience growing up helped you be a better founder?
Well, I think all of my experience, when you look at the credit card company, You Promise, the internet game companies, I always feel like there's something I took away from them, right? Which is how to
Hmm.
operate a company, whether you could build a business for something from altruism. And I think along that line, I think being Asian certainly helped. Like I had a sense of finances, I had this sense of frugality, if you know me well,
Yeah,
to say the way that I operated for many, many years at Credit Karma that helped us through a lot of those lean times, whether it was recession, whether it was COVID, where all these moments were like, my gosh, thank goodness we don't have $100 million cost infrastructure that
yeah,
we can't pare back if some tragedy comes, right?
yeah.
So yes, short answer is yes, it helped a
And
ton.
then do you think there anything about your cultural upbringing that actually held you back as a leader?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to this idea of, I think that I could have always had a little bit more swagger. I could have had a little bit more, I don't know if leadership comes across in Asian families in the traditional sense, right? So all of these things I had to learn, but I don't regret any of it. And for me, it was all a learning experience, right? I mean, we're gifted with things that we do really well. None of us are perfect. None of us do everything well. We're going to excel in some areas and we're not going to be as good as in other areas, right? And I think growing and learning is all about challenging yourself. And as an Asian founder, I found like there are a number of blessings that I had, and there are a number of challenges, and that's no different than anyone else. But I think it's the attitude, right? Maybe the one maybe through line that certainly helped was watching my parents and their can-do approach to really kind of getting through adversity. And, I think that is something that is tremendously powerful and helpful.
So you've mentioned swagger a number of times now, so it sounds like something that you've been thinking about. I also encourage people to have more swagger as well, and not be like an NPC, but be the main character kind of energy. I wonder like how things have been different. I mean, you succeeded, you did like a great outcome. Like, what would swagger have done for you that would have been different than the outcome you had?
Yeah, I think you're hitting on a really important point, right? When I say swagger, it's not hubris, it's not an ego, right? It's really a little bit of more of a self-confidence, right? And that to me is what swagger is. And I don't know what the outcomes would have been. I think I would have gotten to, I don't want to say I'm not at my destination, so to speak, right? But I would have grown faster, right? I would have been more
Mm,
confident in my ability to talk to the company. I would have been better at my town halls. I would have been able to communicate the vision better, so all these things that when I look back at when, a 2010 Ken versus a 2023 Ken, I noticed
mhm.
all the ways that I changed. And I wish I could have gotten there faster sooner, because I think that makes you a more effective leader. And again, it's not about ego. It's about ability to have confidence in the things that you're trying to communicate and the vision and the outcome that you're trying to drive.
So 2023 Ken would have gotten a $16 billion outcome with your new sense of style and everything else. I'm like, oh yeah, I can see that. No, it's funny because I tell people that, but without telling them what the like why that matters, it's hard to justify. It's like, oh, you have to have that confidence because people, whether it be more people will feel more confident following you as a confident leader, or more people will have, they'll be more inspired if you're a more confident leader. But on the flip side of that, when you're more humble, when you're authentic, and that comes across too, it's a different style of leadership, and people, I think they follow that too because they're like, oh, he's being vulnerable, and I really value that. He's not kind of he's not he's not faking it. This is actually what he really believes. So I mean, it could have, it can go either way, but I think it's more that when opportunities arise to speak up in a meeting, or take that chance or something, or have someone else, when someone else is speaking down to you, when you have swagger, you don't let that happen. You kind of you're more willing to push back. You don't let anyone kind of push you around in that sense. And that's what I hope more people would have, especially, Asian Americans who feel like it's not their place. Sometimes like, oh, we very much had that stay in your lane mentality where we're not supposed to say things. A lot of the stuff that I've been doing in terms of speaking out and activism is like, well, that's people always come as like, oh, I've never seen an Asian really say these things before. But that's what I mean. It's like, well, why not? Like, why haven't we seen more people do that? And it's antithetical to what we're used to seeing.
Yeah, and I really want to press upon this point, which is, I think you can be all of the above. And you can be humble, you can be modest, you can still have swagger, right? I don't think they're
Hmm.
necessarily mutually exclusive, right? I
Hmm.
always think about really the how matters as much as the what, right? Meaning, when I'm timid in a meeting, I realize, well, you can have the debates, but and I always said this at Credit Karma, like you and I can disagree on an outcome, on a way of doing something, but I will always do it in a way that respectful to you, that will make you feel like part of the team, and it won't be personal. I mean, I think those are the balances of being genuine, being authentic, being who you are, having swagger, right? All of those things are characteristics that are not at odds with each other if you really spend time and effort trying to understand and
Yeah.
focus on the awareness side of it, but understanding, how to deal with conflict and, things that sometimes don't come naturally.
Yeah, and I think it's a big part of like the cultural upbringing that, at least in East Asian cultures, because I know, in South Asian cultures, a lot of men they're very comfortable with, conflict, but a lot of us are like, hey, Confucianism, like this, that we're supposed to be, everything should be peaceful, and that conflict is a bad thing, so we don't want to, ruffle any feathers or start anything, so we just passive aggressively keep our mouths shut. But yeah, with swagger, you're not worried about that, and it's okay to have those conversations. But yeah, but I mean, so you bring this up, and then you just brought this quote up. I did look up who said the quote, but you brought it up at a conference the other day, uh, about this being passive. America was waking up, as Germany once did, to the awareness that one third of our people will kill one third of that one third of people want to kill the other third of our people, while one third just watches. It was from Harlan Coben, the boy from the woods. I think it was Werner Herzog was misattributed to a director, but I found the person who actually said that. But this kind of goes to the standing by and watching. You brought that up, and I want to hear kind of more of your thoughts on when you heard that quote and what it meant to you.
Yeah, so I was part of the Aspen Institute Henry Crown Fellow in 2018, and in that class, you talk quite a bit about the good society, which is really, as a business leader, what do you envision as the good society, and what are the ways that you can speak up, speak out, and participate in creating that? And around that time, it felt like a little bit of a philosophical academic exercise where we would, 4 times a year get into a classroom study and to, read and debate. But I think it really all came to head, around George Floyd. And for me personally, it was a lot of those lessons. It was also me growing up as a leader and thinking about how to be more of an Asian role model. And it's very obvious to me that as a minority, as a Chinese American, I personally didn't feel like I was doing enough. And that quote really resonated with me. And speaking to George Floyd, if you go and look at some of those pictures, right, there's real symbolism here, right? You had a white officer with, his knee on the neck of a black man. If you look at the pictures closely, you also see an Asian officer who was standing by. And to me, it was like almost a perfect analogy of that exact quote, which is, we weren't helping murder the man, but we were not helping him either, right? And I always think about that in context to minorities and what we do in America and our lack of voting, our lack of engagement in civic affairs. And this is not everyone, but this is obviously on the average. And I think we can do more. And it always resonated with me as if that 1/3 of America votes, if they are active in the process, we can change a lot of the outcomes, right? And that's not me advocating for any particular outcome, but more noticing that 1/3 of us are on the sidelines. And the more that we can engage that group, I think a better democracy we could have.
And so now that you've stepped away from Credit Karma, like what is next for you? Is getting more involved in kind of political engagement, getting you engaged, civil engagement? What else is next for you?
I mean, I think all of those things are always in the back of my mind, right? I mean, I in so many ways have come to America and lived the, picturesque American dream. Sure, it was hard, sure, it was challenging, but in many ways, that is the American dream. At least it was for my family. And I find it really hard to close that door for other people. So I think that's in the back of my mind. But with that said, I'm 3 or 4 months away from stepping away. My goal is to at least step away for 6 to 9 months without thinking about what's next, and just enjoying the moment and being. So that's what I'm spending a bunch of my time on.
Got it. And one question I have, did you have an executive coach while you were leading Credit Karma?
I didn't have an executive coach, but I did have a lot of great mentors and people that I was learning from. So, whether it was board members, whether it was through YPO, whether it was Aspen Institute, I surrounded myself with people who were actually going through growing experiences as well. And I tried to learn as much as I could. So, I think you certainly could do it by yourself, but I think the reality is the more people that you can learn from, role model, see that the struggles aren't unique, the faster you come out on the other side of that, that experience.
Yeah. And I think you also, the more you realize you're not as alone as you think you are, people have gone through a lot of similar stuff. Okay, so what is the ultimate legacy you want to leave behind for your kids?
Well, I've been thinking about this one a lot. So my kids are, 9 and 12. And, for me, growing up, my parents was all, in many ways about financial outcomes and sort of being able to, get out of the, sort of the lower class of economics. As I see my kids grow up, I always think about like them just being good humans, right? I mean, I think that to me is probably the most important piece, is that they're good people and that they're happy, right? I mean, in some regards, we put so much value pressure on financial success. Now I get it. You need a level, right, of being able to pay the bills to be secure. But I guess having seen more of the financial success over time, I realize that's not the end all be all. And, as a parent, I focus a lot more on how do I make sure they're well adjusted? How do I make sure that they're happy, that they feel fulfilled, and not about being a doctor or lawyer or financial success, but that happiness, that joy, that having a sense of purpose gives you. That's what I focus my kids on, and hopefully, that's where they ultimately, have their lives.
Awesome. And I guess, our audience is mostly Asian American professionals. So I'd love to hear any advice you have for, folks who are Asian American professionals in the community, like on their A lot of them feel pressure, like you said, to be, successful financially. But like for those who want to become founders, what's your advice to some of them? Because a lot of them feel like they need to keep that safe job and it's too scary to take a risk.
Well, I mean, I think this is where, it cuts both ways, where a lot of that, quiet humility, modesty kind of come in, and that sort of can hurt us, right? So what I would give advice to all those people is, have a bit more swagger, but then also play up, the, I always think the authenticity, who you are and showing people that, like you said it really well, which is, when you can show that side of you, people tend to trust a lot more, right? So there are so many advantages, but we have to learn how to use both sort of the advantages and disadvantages. So for all those, take the risk, be authentic, be genuine, do the things that really, move you. That would be my advice.
Awesome. And this is why I call it hyphenation, because we're lucky enough to have the bridge between both cultures, two cultures that we have superpowers from. And so, I always say we should use both of them to our advantage. But Ken, thanks so much for taking the time today and sharing your story and your advice with kind of the next gen. This is a legacy I think we can leave behind for a lot of folks to learn from. And thank you for being, an inspiration to many people that, your parents were to you. I think, this generation needs folks like that. You are the Jerry Yang that I had to many people. So I think it's, and don't be modest about it because it is, it is what it is, and own it. Have that swagger. But yes, thank you so much, Ken, for taking the time. Really appreciate it. All right.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Hyphen Nation. Please subscribe to my Substack at www.davelou.com and follow us on Instagram at the Hyphen Nation and LinkedIn at Hyphen Nation.